scaffold of American history. I'm clearly going to glaze over a lot of the details, but hopefully it'll give you a sense of how everything at least fits together, at least the major events in American history. So you can kind of, and when I say American history, I'm talking about United States history. And so the first real successful settlement in what's now the United States was at Jamestown. That's Jamestown, Virginia, right over here, and it was 1607. It was set up as kind of a commercial settlement, and then shortly after that, and we always learned this in school, you know, the Pilgrims on the Mayflower, sailing the oceans blue and all the rest, they were kind of the next major settlement in the New World, or I guess we should say the next major successful English settlement. There were obviously the Spanish and the Portuguese were already settling the New World with a good bit of success at this point, but we're talking about the English settlements. And so the Pilgrims settled Plymouth, what's now Plymouth, Massachusetts, in 1620. And obviously from 1620 until the mid-1700s, you just had a huge influx of people migrating and cities developing. But I'm going to fast forward all the way to the mid-1700s. So this is actually a huge amount of time that I'm just not providing any details over, because I'm really just going focused on the major events in American history. And so this is a 130-year period where things were just getting built out more. They were getting more developed. And I'm going to fast forward to 1754, because at this period, you had essentially the entire east coast of what's now the U.S. These were the 13 colonies of the well, they're not the United States yet. They're the 13 British colonies, but these are English settlements. And then if you go a little bit to the northwest from there, you have all of the French settlements. And obviously still in these parts of, you know, in Quebec and Canada, people speak French, but you have the French settlements up in this area over here, and I'm not going to go to the details. Each of these can be a whole series of videos, and hopefully in the future I will make them whole series of videos. But you fast forward to 1754, and you start having the French and the British start getting into squabbles over territory where Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is right now in 1754. And that starts the French and Indian War. And I want to be very clear here, because this is maybe one of the biggest points of confusion when people first learn American history. Since it's called the French and Indian War, they think it's between the French and the Indians. But it's not. It was the French and the Indians against the British and the colonists. So in this war, the British and the colonists were on the same side against the French and the Indians. And obviously there were some Indians that were also on the side of the British, but it's called the French and Indian War because these were the people that the British were fighting against. Now, if anyone outside of the United States talks about the French and Indian War, they will not call it the French and Indian War. They'll really just call that the American theater of the 7 Years' War, because it eventually evolves into a much bigger conflict between Great Britain and France that's going on in Europe, and the French and Indian War was really just the American theater of it. So the French and Indian War starts in 1754 based on these disputes over Pittsburgh, but that wasn't the only thing. You had all of these other things all of these other tensions that were developing. The thing that starts the war is never the only factor. It's always just the tipping point. But that leads to a bigger war in Europe, and that's the 7 Years' War that starts in 1756 and ends. They both end because they're really the same war. They both end in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. Treaty of Paris, 1763. And the big takeaway of that is that really most of what France had in the New World now becomes essentially a part of the British Empire, now becomes British colonies or British territories. And even Louisiana goes over to Spain at this point, and we'll see it goes back to France for a little bit in 1800, and then it goes back to the United States in 1803, but we'll see that in a second. So 1763, the British, it was this huge, costly war, but they were able to win. And at least from the point of view of the British, they felt that the main beneficiaries of this war were the Americans. They were able to get all of this new territory, all of this new area that they can now trade with, or they can now potentially settle. And so the British decide to start taxing the Americans for at least some portion, to recoup some portion of the cost of the war. So they passed, in 1765, they passed the Stamp Act. And this wasn't a tax on stamps. What this was is that they essentially declared that a whole set of paper that had to be used in the New World. So special stamp on it in order for the contracts or whatever was on top of it in order for them to be legitimate. So it essentially was a huge tax on paper and on documents, and essentially this is what kind of societies ran on. So it was just a way to extract money from the colonists in order to